Okay, let's see if the stream is happy. Looks like it is. Okay, here we are. I'm standing on a treadmill, so hopefully it doesn't become too annoying. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome if you were new. Let's see, last time I was here, I was talking about, certainly made some mention of how many millions of barrels of oil a day we pull out of the ground. 100 million barrels of oil a day. And I talked about that a lot. It's hard for people to comprehend numbers like this. I was having this discussion with my wife a few days back, and I said, yeah, we pull the planet working together, all of us, we pull 100 million barrels of oil out of the day. And we had like a 10-minute discussion about that. Like, what does that even mean? What is that number? Where did that come from? 100 million barrels of oil a day, really? A day, not a year, not a month, a day, every day. 100 million barrels of oil a day. And it's not really stored anywhere. It's not like we're pumping all that out and storing most of it, laying it up for a rainy day. We burn it. It may take us 4 months to burn a given barrel of oil, but eventually it gets burned, and we have to keep pumping every single day 100 million barrels of oil a day in order to burn, at some point, daily, another 100 million barrels of oil a day. So these are big numbers, right? These are crazy numbers. These are really crazy numbers. Most people wouldn't even know what those numbers mean. 100 million barrels of oil a day. A barrel is 40 gallons, I think. So this is the nature of our problem, actually, that the things we're doing on this earth, the numbers associated with our activities are so huge, starting with a number that is also incomprehensible. 8 billion people. And now there's a lot of people who tell you that 8 billion is your problem right there. You need to go no further. But that's not true. We have 8 billion people, 8,000 million people, because of fossil fuels, primarily because of crude oil. But, whatever. The crude oil came first, is my point. The crude oil came first, and then we got 8,000 million people. Now we're going to have to give up on crude oil and coal and natural gas, but crude oil is kind of the king here with regards to fossil fuel consumption. Crude oil consumption allows us to extract natural gas. Crude oil consumption allows us to extract coal and to find uses for these things. So measuring our problem in terms of crude oil, like 100 million barrels a day, is not a bad reference point. So the chart that's on the screen right now, though, is something I got to thinking about this morning when we were watching a YouTube channel, part of our news feed, Just Have a Think. It's a pretty good channel. Anybody who's watching me is almost certainly watching Just Have a Think. And Dave was reminding us once again that our rate of CO2 emissions, tied, of course, to a lot of things, but primarily coal, oil, and natural gas consumption, our rate of CO2 emissions has gone up to close to 40 billion. This map here, this chart that's on the screen right now, is dated 2023, so it's about as current as you can get. 2024 isn't over yet, by the way. So, well, we'll get another number for that, and it'll be probably really close to 40 billion tons of CO2 emissions annually. Now, billion is a big number. 40 billion is a really big number. And tons, this is tons of CO2. Now, the problem with all this, and this is where people are going to have trouble. And this wife and I had like a 30-minute discussion about the problem with annual CO2 emissions and what all that is about. So I'm going to look at this chart and I'm going to try and make some sense out of this for people. Now, the colors aren't all that important. What's important about this chart is that it starts in 1750 and it goes to, like I said, 2023. So it starts in 1750, and you'll notice that the number of billions of tons, because that's what the left axis is, billions of tons, is zero. We did not burn, we did not release billions of tons of CO2 in 1750. Now, it looks like it's zero. It's really not. It's 0 billions, but it's not zero. So if I were to go over here and actually look at this, look at this chart, I can actually hover over about the year 1750, and you'll see that the bottom number in that little hover is actually the biggest, and it's close to 10 million tons. So in Europe, the estimate is that they were emitting in Europe 10 million tons of CO2. Now, a million is also a big number, but it's not a billion. A billion is 1,000 times larger than a million. So they were doing 10 million tons of CO2. How were they doing that? Oh, burning forests, probably using some coal, maybe doing some other things. Some of this is estimates, land use probably. As you go along and you get closer to 1800, that number on the bottom goes up, and pretty soon North America comes in at 3,000 tons. 3,000 tons, thousands, not even millions. You get it to 1800, and all of a sudden there's lots of players here, and we're up to 31 million. Still not a billion. Still not even 1 billion. We got a long ways to go before we get to 1 billion. And if you go to 1850, you're still not to 1 billion, and you're barely starting to register on this chart at all. These numbers, to 122 million tons, is still so small compared to current emissions that it barely registers on this chart. It's tiny. 122 million tons annually is what we were emitting in 1850. Pretty much 50 years into the Industrial Revolution. And by 1850, we were enjoying all kinds of benefits. Steam locomotives, steam engines. We were working with a lot of steel, mining and foundries, and the whole thing associated with that. 1850, by the time we get to 1900, of course, we're deep into it. And we're still not at 1 billion tons annually. Even by 1900. Ford Motor Company and the rail systems, and we're almost about to have the First World War and all this stuff. Ships at sea made out of steel, all this kind of crazy stuff. Ships at sea using steam engines, burning tons and tons of coal. Still haven't even reached 500 million tons annually of CO2 release. And finally, in 1900, this chart is starting to show some data. My point here is that from about 1900, certainly 1950, of course, is the end, typically think of it as the end of the Second World War, meaning everyone's gone home. We're starting to rebuild our industries. And by 1950, we're kind of back on course after 2 world wars, pretty much back to back. And lo and behold, in 1950, we're burning finally close to 6 billion tons of fossil fuels and releasing 6 billion tons of CO2. So these numbers after 1950 are insane. We embark on a pattern of consuming fossil fuels, clear-cutting forests, and then releasing the resulting CO2, carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. That is pretty much unprecedented. Even during the prior up to 1950, between 1900 and 1950, there was an increase in CO2 emissions, but it wasn't like a rocket. It didn't go up like a rocket. But after 1950, it did. And the key here is these are annual emissions. Every year, these numbers are going up. Every year, this is what we do to the atmosphere. So that currently, we're up to about 40 billion tons of CO2 emissions every year. And when you hear someone talk about, oh, well, we're going to have net zero emissions. Net means you're still emitting CO2, but you've come up with some sort of magical process to remove it. So there's emission over here, and there's subtraction over there, and between the addition and the subtraction, you get zero, right? They balance out. But if you're going to just have net zero, if you're going to balance out our emissions, then you have to remove from the atmosphere annually everything you put into the atmosphere that year. That's net zero. And that doesn't remove everything you put in before this year. So in the future, if they're planning on being net zero for CO2 emissions, then they're really committing to removing 40 billion tons of matter from the atmosphere. 40 billion tons. A ton is a lot. It's not 40 billion pounds. 40 billion tons. And they're not going to do that. They're not going to do that. They can't do that. They can say, oh, well, net zero, we'll just remove as much as we emit. And everyone's walking around saying, that sounds like a good idea, so we can continue emitting? Yeah, sure, why not? Well, in the future, we'll just remove it. But they're removing 40 billion tons. How? And then, where do you put it? This isn't 40 billion tons of wheat. If it was 40 billion tons of wheat we were talking about, you could eat it. It's not 40 billion tons of, tulips. It's not 40 billion tons of anything nice. It's 40 billion tons of carbon locked up in CO2. And it's in the atmosphere because we already dug up out of the ground 40 billion tons of carbon and released it into the atmosphere as CO2. Now, it's not quite, there's stoichiometry I'm not dealing with here because CO2 is a heavier molecule than carbon, C, by itself. So there is some fraction of a ton of coal that goes into the atmosphere as a ton of CO2. And there's a chemical equation, and there's some stoichiometry, but I'm not going to get into it. You can't think of it as one-to-one. 1 ton of coal becomes 1 ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But it's useful to think of it that way. And the reason why it's useful to think of it that way is that 1 ton of coal, when it's sitting on the ground or in the ground, or let's say you just dug it up, you brought it to the surface and you just dump it on the ground. Here, there it is, 1 ton of coal. Okay, it's a solid. You pick it up with your hand. Here's a lump of coal. You could do whatever you want to do with it. Put it in your back pocket, right? Walk around with it in your pocket. You can manage coal. In fact, if you wanted to, you could dig it up out of the ground, take that coal, walk over to another hole in the ground, and throw it in. And there's no good reason to do that. But I'm pointing out that because coal is a solid and a stable solid, you can do that. Oil is the same. You can pump oil out of the ground. It's a liquid at room temperature, atmospheric temperature. You can put it in a barrel. You can put it in a measuring cup. You can pour it over your head. You can do anything you want with it. It's completely stable. And you could put it right back in the ground if you wanted to. Natural gas is a little different because it starts out as a gas. But, so long as it's in a pipeline, you can manage it. Now, when you release these things into the atmosphere, when you burn the coal, and the waste products, carbon dioxide, water, and a bunch of other noxious things, including particulates, when they go in the atmosphere, some of those things stay in the atmosphere essentially forever. And the part we're worried about is the CO2. And the CO2, once it's in the atmosphere, it's invisible. You can't see it. You can't smell it. You can measure it using chemistry. And of course they do, because we wouldn't even know what the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere is, except that we can measure it. You can measure it, but you can't see it, can't smell it. You have no way to know that it's there. So this is like the perfect crime. If they can burn coal, oil, and natural gas, and all other things being equal, except for things like particulates, and nitrous oxides, and sulfur dioxides, and other things that are harmful to the environment, which they can filter out, by the way, and they do. Apart from those things, the CO2, which is completely harmless to life, plants use it, it's fertilizer, for plants. We breathe it out. We breathe in oxygen. We breathe out CO2. It's not a big deal. But that's only for living things. As far as the Earth dynamic system goes, the CO2 increases the naturally occurring greenhouse effect. And greenhouse effect heats the planet. And we currently, I mean, before we got started, you know, what was the point on the chart? Say 1950. Prior to about 1950, you know, our impacts on the greenhouse effect probably weren't that noticeable. Not that they weren't there, by the way, but we just weren't looking. We didn't really notice. But I can promise you, after 1950, we're really playing with fire, literally. Okay, pun intended. We are playing with fire. There is so much CO2 going into the atmosphere that it's basically choking the system to death. The greenhouse effect is about to completely go off the charts. I have another chart here that shows the cumulative effect of all this stuff. And you've seen this chart before. This has a very different date range. Can I enlarge this? I can. This has a very different date range. Whereas that other chart started at 1750. This one starts 800,000 years ago. Humans don't even show up on this chart until 300,000 years ago. And of course, although those are anatomically modern humans, they're certainly not culturally modern. Modernity, as we know it, started 100 years ago, maybe 300 years ago, possibly. Not even on this chart. There isn't even a place for modernity. They show you an arrow over on the right. 1950, they show you the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 1950, already off the chart as far as the previous 800,000 years. 1950 is already off the chart. So by 1950, we're deep, deep into modernity, deep. And you know, you could easily make a case that it goes back thousands of years, the modern world. Certainly modern thought goes back 1,000 years. So what's interesting about this chart is where it says current level. And this is wrong, by the way. I guess this is old data. Current level, if you read to the left, it's at 420 parts per million. Well, that's not completely wrong. Yeah, it is. 420 parts per million. We're probably closer to 430 right now. So this isn't too far off. But the point is, 420 parts per million exceeds 800,000 years of CO2 in the atmosphere. It goes up and down a little bit with the Milankovitch cycles, the ice ages, the ice epochs, whatever you want to call them. We are currently in an interglacial, so we're at a peak for CO2. And before we got really involved with fossil fuels, the peak was about 280. And 280 is fairly common for these interglacials. The four prior to this one were all about 280. And the four prior to the current four was even a little bit lower, like 260. So CO2 can get as high as 280 during an interglacial, so that wouldn't be too unusual. But now we've taken that to 420. And there's no sign, there's absolutely no sign of not continuing that trend. That is the trend, up. And that line goes up like a rocket. And that line goes up like a rocket because this line goes up like a rocket. This is what's happening here. Our annual emissions of CO2, broken down by year, is why that 800,000 year long chart has that line at the end that goes up like a rocket. This is what we're doing. We have taken the Earth system to a place that's completely, for the last million years or so, completely unfamiliar. We did not evolve in the Earth dynamic system that we are now creating. We did not. We didn't exist the last time the Earth was at these levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And there's some discussion about how this is going to change the Earth and when. The when is, well, it's already started. When does it stop changing? Meaning, when do the changes equilibrate and become constant? and stable and predictable? Maybe 1,000 years. So the changes we've instigated are going to continue to change for 1,000 years, probably. And, given all the feedbacks and all the tipping points and all the other things that are going to happen because of what we have done, it's going to take the Earth system about 1,000 years probably to settle back down. And then it'll be like that. And whatever part per million, let me go back to this other chart. Wherever that rocket line, current level, stops, and it could stop way off of this current chart. This chart stops at about 480 parts per million. Our activity, we may not stop our activity until this line, current level, exceeds 1,000 parts per million. Certainly 500. I don't see any way in the world we even look at curtailing our fossil fuel consumption until this chart called current level crosses 500. So we come back to this chart in 30 years? Look at this again. I might still be alive. You might be too. We might have this discussion again. And we come back here, we look at current level, and it's so far off the chart that these little wobbly lines down below are just way at the bottom. Barely even discernible. Just little tiny variations over 800,000 years, and then a rocket goes off. And that's us. We're doing that. And we're doing that annually to the tune of this. Currently heading for 40 billion tons of CO2 emissions annually. And you kind of get a feel that, that's probably about right. Because the other number that I talk about on here a lot is that every single day, every day, somewhere on the world, everywhere around the world, people are consuming 100 million barrels of crude oil daily. Every single day, 100 million. 100 million barrels. And a barrel is 40 gallons. 100 million barrels. And so is this chart here so terribly off when we know that for crude oil alone, we're consuming 100 million barrels? And these numbers are so huge, they don't even fit in the human brain. And we are lofting 40 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere annually. 40 billion tons. And when someone comes along and they say, we'll just remove that, you would have a hard time moving 40 billion tons of anything. Rock, something solid, water. You would have a difficult time shifting and finding a place to store 40 billion tons of anything. Just name it. 40 billion tons of elephants. 40 billion tons of elephant manure. Where would you even put 40 billion tons of horse shit? Where would you put it? Anything at all. And that's the easy stuff. Solid stuff like horse shit. Elephant manure. Chicken feathers. 40 billion tons of any of these things is easier to deal with than 40 billion tons of CO2, which is a gas. You can't even see it. You can't handle it. You could handle the coal because it's a solid. But once you burn it, the gases go in the atmosphere. They're out of reach for all practical purposes. They really are completely out of reach. You'll never touch that CO2. You'll never remove it. It's a gas. You can't see it. You can't smell it. It doesn't react in chemistry. It's inert. They use CO2 as a fire retardant. They use CO2 to put out fires. This stuff is not easy to do anything with. And we're putting 40 billion tons of this shit in the atmosphere annually, every year. And because humans can't comprehend this, because these numbers are so gigantic, they are incomprehensible. Because of that, it becomes impossible to discuss the nature of our problem and the possibilities or lack thereof of any possible solution. These numbers, we lost control of this process in 1800. In 1800, we were already in trouble. And it's been 200 years since then. And all we've done is made it worse. And right now, There is no sign of slacking off. And even if we stopped growing our annual consumption of fossil fuels, and even if we stopped growing our emissions of CO2, we would stop at 40 billion tons a year. It's not like stopping growing it makes it go to zero. That would be shrinking it. If we just stopped growing our emissions of CO2, just didn't do any more than we're doing right now today, didn't drill any new wells, didn't make any new automobiles, didn't grow any more acres of food. If we just stopped biggering and just kept it like it is this year, it would be stuck at 40 billion tons. And to get it to 0 billion tons, like it was in the year 1750, where it wasn't even zero, it was like 9 million, right? To get it down to a number that at least, is not so terrifying as the one we have now. 1750, 1800, what was it? What was it even in 1850? Like, this is like old school steampunk, right? 122 million. Just to get back. Well, this isn't the total. This is Europe. This is just Europe. To get back to where we were in 1850, just look at the size of that line on this chart. Just look at the size of it. It barely registers. And that was 1850. That was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We would have to go back to that to have any narrative at all that we've made a difference. Any narrative of any kind. 1850. Probably 1750. Are we going to do that? No, we're not going to do that. We can't do that. And all this flapdoodle, all this ridiculous noise about, oh, well, some future generation is just going to remove the CO2. It's madness. It's just madness. Except it's not mad. They know exactly what they're doing when they say that. This is all carefully worded language in the IPCC reports. It was there in the AR5, and it's there in AR6. And they talk all the time about net zero emissions. Net zero means you'll still have emissions, but you're going to remove them somehow. And all their discussions and all their prognostications are based on net zero. And it's completely unhinged. It's completely insane. But they have to say it. And because they're the ones writing the reports, all the governments and all the corporations and all everybody else, since they're the ones writing the reports, they can frame the problem however they want to. But this is your problem. This is your problem. That 1850, the amount of CO2 being emitted in 1850 doesn't even register on this chart. Isn't even visible at the bottom of the chart. It's like not there. And now we're at 40 billion tons annually. And the 40 billion tons annually of CO2 emissions is why we have 8,000 million people. Not the other way around. We don't have these emissions because we have 8,000 million people. The emissions came first. The emissions came first. And they were used to create electrical power plants, put more arable land under cultivation, transport food further. Wow, these days we transport food in cargo aircraft. We weren't doing that in 1900 or even 1950. That's pretty recent. Back in 1850, we were doing it in steam locomotives, transporting things. And now we do it with aircraft. Cargo aircraft. Move food all over the planet. We do crazy stuff, and some of it's just absolutely brilliant, right? Some of it's amazing. But nevertheless, 40 billion tons of CO2 annually released into the atmosphere. And there is no conceivable way to zero that out. That line just goes up until we hit the Seneca Cliff. And the Seneca Cliff, as I mentioned in the last video, the Seneca Cliff is where you've gone along, you've grown your civilization, you've grown your GDP, you biggered, you fastered, you've made everything more efficient, you did all this, and then you come to a point where you just can't keep doing it. Usually it's environmental cues, it could be complexity stress, it could be internal cultural stress, whatever it is. You get to a point where you can't do it anymore. And then, because it took all the swimming you could really do just to keep, all the juggling you could really do to keep all the chainsaws up in the air as it was, as soon as you stumble and stammer and you can't do it anymore, it all comes crashing down. All the chainsaws that you were juggling successfully come crashing down And of course, you're standing under them when it happens. And that's probably our fate at this point, is the 40 billion tons of CO2 annually is going to destroy the planet, at least the life on the planet. And it's going to do that by messing around with the weather. It's going to do that by making the planet too hot for life, including crops, because those are alive, right? When you get your bag of Cheetos, you don't think of a bag of Cheetos from the store as being alive. But when it was corn, it was alive. When it was, milk and dairy, it was alive. But when it gets too hot, you won't be able to have those raw ingredients to make Cheetos or pizzas or, anything else. Least of all, the simpler things like just a loaf of bread or the meat that comes to your market or even the vegetables, if they have to travel more than 10 miles? Hell, I live in a city right now that's 10 miles across, both directions from where I live. And there's no agriculture at the edge of 10 miles where I live. None. There's nothing. Zero. There's asphalt. There's asphalt at 10 miles away from where I live. So how's the food going to get to me? Well, I'm going to have to grow it myself, aren't I? Maybe I work with my neighbors. Maybe I find some unused land around near my house, and I start farming near my house, or I start farming in my backyard, or my neighbors. We pool our resources and we take down the fences behind our houses. And we collectively farm our backyards together. I don't know. We're going to figure something out, because 40 billion tons of CO2 annually is not going to continue. It can't. It just can't. We're going to hit a wall, or more aptly, we're going to go over a cliff. We're going to go over a cliff. And when we do, it's going to come as a complete surprise to people. But when you see this chart and what a rocket this thing has been, and when you see this other one, when you realize the changes we've made to the Earth system and how this is going to continue to go straight up, our current level is going to go way off the top of this chart. Way off the top. That's when you realize, oh yeah, we're in for a fall. And the key is, don't let people tell you that they are going to change this. There is no technology to change that. That is essentially a problem for the Earth itself to fix. And the Earth itself, maybe it'll make a change, but it'll take, 1 million years? 10 million years? Something. The way that the Earth changes things like this. And this one too. Now, this is emissions. This could change overnight. How is that? Basically, economic collapse. If you look at the top of this chart, I'll use the pointer to point to it. Right there. That's COVID, right? There was 35.01 billion tons that came out at about the time of COVID. Everything dropped a lot. The changes that happened during the pandemic just about destroyed the global economy. Just about. And you see this little dip right here, right there. Little dip. That's a tiny little dip compared to all this way down here, right? This is where we probably should be, if not way down here someplace. And this tiny little dip didn't even get us to there. Didn't even get us to that point. It just barely moved the needle on annual emissions. And yet it nearly destroyed the global economy. There are still countries recovering from that. There are still aspects of our civilization that haven't quite recovered. But that 40 billion tons needs to go to 0 billion tons. And when were we doing 0 billion tons? Way back here. 1800, 1850. Because these aren't billions, these are thousands. And millions. Getting close to a billion, probably. Oh, probably not even half a billion. So this is 1850 wasn't even billions. But that's where we have to go back to. And how are we going to do that? A little COVID bump nearly drove the planet insane. And yet we have to bump all the way back down to 1850 levels. Who's going to do that? Who's going to sign up for that? Who's going to engineer that? Who's going to vote for that? What treaty are we going to pass involving how many nations are going to agree to it? Nothing. Nothing. But it will. It will fall. It will probably fall to 0. Because if we don't do it, nature will do it to us. Now, that's hard to imagine. how nature could do that. But you know, when it's 140 degrees outside, global heating, that's what we're calling it. So that's what it is. When it's 140 degrees outside during the day and it's 125 degrees at night, you're done. You're done. You're just done. You can't even breathe the air outside when it's more than 110. People do. People get sick and people die. They go to the hospital at 110, 120. It's going to be completely unhinged. It's going to be completely crazy. At that point, we're done. We're just done. And, you know, then our 40 billion tons of emissions annually will end up being zero or close to it. So that's what I wanted to say on that. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I come back here once in a while to terrorize people, and sometimes I'm even on a treadmill getting some exercise. You should too. You need to be fit. You need to be ready for this.